you've ever looked into the wonderful, wacky world of LGBTQIA+++ news, you've no doubt come across what is sometimes referred to as the pink press. Now, there's a good reason that this exists. After all, the mainstream media doesn't really have the capacity to cover every single story that is going on out there. So naturally, organisations are going to turn up which claim to look into specific stories that are relevant to specific parts of the population. Now, there are some quite big names within LGBT news. Probably one of the biggest is Pink News. This is a British-based website that mostly deals with trans news nowadays, but previously, it was mostly focused on the LGB section. You also have other websites like Gay Star News, again, another British website, but then you also have American outlets like LGBTQ Nation and Queerty, a website that describes itself as being without an agenda except the gay one. Now, that's quite an important point that they're making there. A lot of these websites claim to be fairly unbiased, and instead, they claim to represent the LGBT community as a whole. Now, is that really possible for news websites to openly do that? No, it really isn't. I mean, private news outlets very, very rarely show no bias in their subjects whatsoever. However, it's interesting when you get the LGBT websites claiming that they do just that. And this is because the LGBT community, as one would expect, is quite wide-reaching. After all, the only real things that we have in common are our sexualities or our gender, and that's pretty much it. Otherwise, we all have our own different beliefs. We have our own set of morals and values, and it's quite hard to encompass all of that into one political outlet. However, try it. These places do really, really try, and whilst I've been incredibly critical of the LGBT press in the past, in this video I wanted to discuss some of the real inconsistencies that I've seen in their reporting, the way in which they speak about conservatives as opposed to those on the left, or the kind of subjects which they openly try to suppress, simply because it goes against a leftist narrative. Now, I want to start this by talking about the way in which they would cover a right-on LGBT person on the left compared to the way they discuss such people on the right, and you should hopefully get an idea of what I'm talking about. So I want to introduce you to this gay man right here. Now, a lot of you probably know who this is, and this is Owen Jones. Now, Owen Jones is a columnist for The Guardian, amongst some other outlets, but he is also very much known for his left-wing views. He is a socialist activist and he is a member of the British Labour Party. However, you wouldn't really understand that if you saw some of the coverage about Owen Jones. For example, here is a story that was ran in May 2019 by Gay Star News. The headline simply reads about how this is a gay man's opinion on Theresa May. This followed Theresa May stepping down as being the British Prime Minister last year, and it's put to the audience as though this is just a run-of-the-mill gay man who has gone viral. Of course, if you know Owen Jones and you know his political leanings, it's anything but that. It's simply a tweet that a political activist put out there that went viral. But it is not portrayed in that way to the audience. You are led to believe that this is a general mainstream gay belief and what a lot of gay people are thinking, when really it's just what a lot of left-wing gay people are thinking. Now, are they as generous with somebody on the right? Let's say, for example, Darren Grimes. Now, here are a number of different headlines that have been ran by Pink News over the last year, and whilst Grimes' sexuality is certainly mentioned in the vast majority of them, you will also notice that they mention his political leanings, that he's a conservative, also that he is a Brexit supporter. And again, the way in which these headlines are written implicates that Grimes has said or done something wrong, that his views are incorrect and they're not in line with what you would expect gay people to believe. I mean, there's even a headline saying that he should know better because he is gay simply because of his comments on trans issues. So they're putting it out there that this is a gay conservative who is expressing the wrong views, and it gives a subliminal message to their readers that simply being conservative is equated with having wrong takes in their opinions. Now, you could make the argument that Grimes has said some controversial things. So do they apply this kind of logic to people on the left who say controversial things as well? Well, let's pick out somebody else. How about Monroe Bergdorf? Now, Bergdorf is incredibly controversial. I have done a whole video discussing her. But for those who don't know, Bergdorf is a model and trans activist, and she really hit the headlines back in 2016 because of her comments on white people. Not white supremacy, white people. And as a result of these comments, she lost a contract at L'Oreal, but in a way that also launched her own career. However, if you look at the gay press, they would really play down the controversy that surrounded Monroe, instead portraying it as simple racism or transphobia. For example, they mention in this particular article that she just called out white supremacy back in 2016. But as I mentioned, if you look at the comments that Monroe made, it is very clear she is not talking about white supremacy, but white people as a whole. Now let's compare the way in which they commented on Monroe Bergdorf's controversial comments with that of another trans person, my friend Blair White. Now, when they reported on a event organised by Walk Away back in March of last year, whenever they talked about Blair, they very much focused on how divisive and controversial her comments were. Again, that is something which they did not do when it came to Monroe Bergdorf. Now, in fact, it's quite interesting that whilst they would give a lot of news coverage to the likes of Owen Jones and Monroe Bergdorf, unless they have a specific hate boner for them, like with Darren Grimes, the more conservative side of the LGBT community very, very rarely gets a look in unless it's a way of having a bit of a jab at them. For example, here is Brandon Starker, who just a few months ago caused a fuss on a flight when he refused to wear a face mask. And look at the kind of language which these outlets used when talking about him. Give this a comparison with Owen Jones. Back when Owen was on TV discussing the Pulse massacre, he openly stormed off, and it became quite a meme at the time. But could you imagine these outlets running that same language with Owen Jones, or the way in which that they would react if the right-wing press used similar words about Owen? We all know that they would accuse him of homophobia, but it's interesting that those kinds of words are okay when it is somebody on the conservative side. Now, you may be a right-wing LGBT person, but not high profile like Darren, Blair or Brandon, and you might be thinking to yourself, well, that's fine, that they're just big names, you would expect that, they wouldn't come for me. Well, yeah, they would as well. Now, I mentioned in a video a couple of months ago about Brokeback Patriots and how Queerty ran a story basically just telling people not to have sex with him. It was just nothing but a hit piece aimed at a man who they disagree with politically. It was a completely trashy article, but that was deemed acceptable for them to run. But they also put that same kind of view forward when just discussing conservative gay men. Here is an article from Pink News calling gay men who want to vote for Donald Trump, in fact, much bigger numbers than they were expecting, I gotta be honest, as saying that they lack any kind of morals, like they're putting their morals to one side. So it doesn't matter whether you're a big name or not, these publications are very openly wanting to attack you, and they're making it very clear that you have no place within this wider LGBT community. And this is a huge, huge problem when you're dealing with a community as big as this, one with plenty of different viewpoints out there. They make it very obvious that they hate people of a particular political leaning. Now, of course, media will always have its bias, and I will address that later. So let's move on to probably a bigger flaw of this kind of medium and how the way in which they portray it as having no agenda and the way in which they cover stories that really do affect the LGBT community. So a lot of you have no doubt heard of Parkfield. Now, this is a school area in Birmingham, in which it became quite high profile last year after a group of Muslim parents started to protest this LGBT inclusive education program which they were running. Eventually, the protest became much larger than just the Muslims, and it included other religious groups. Now, it was kind of an interesting situation because both sides really kind of had to decide who they were going to side with here. Was it the gays or was it the Muslims? But Pink News and the rest of the gay press decided to kind of have their cake and eat it. And they condemned the protests, but they completely left out who it is that was protesting them. And this is a big problem when you're removing the context as to why this is happening. The gay press completely ignored something which is known as the British Attitude Survey, which indicated that there are particular ethnic and religious groups that have less of an acceptance to LGBT people compared to the wider British society. Furthermore, there are very few, if any, comments on another survey in 2016 on Muslim acceptance of the gays. And this is very important when you really want to address the context of why all of this was happening. And this is important to know for LGBT people as well, because if there are going to be conflicts between different groups, it's important to understand where everyone is coming from. By completely ignoring this, and instead in articles on Parkview, bringing in how Islamophobia is on the rise and bringing in kind of names to downplay any kind of Islamic influence on what was going on, it leaves the audience with a less of an understanding as to why any of this situation was happening. This is ultimately a failure of reporting and keeping their audiences properly informed. And of course, Parkview wasn't the only time in which they've done this. A lot of these outlets have been very vocal in their support of Black Lives Matter, and they have been for a number of years. When reporting on BLM in the past, a lot of these outlets have really kind of downplayed exactly what was happening. For example, in Edmonton, when their Pride event was shut down for 2019, they didn't really mention that a lot of this was because of pressure from Black Lives Matter. And when it is mentioned, so for example in Toronto, the activists are given a complete right of reply with all of their demands publicly listed. But they have also downplayed some of the attacks that BLM activists have taken part in against LGBT people. I mentioned earlier that they've only really talked about Brandon Strako in regards to his face mask incident, but they completely neglected to inform any of their audiences that BLM activists attacked him and Mike Harlow following the Republican convention. But going back to the right of reply, that is something which they did not give to what they consider to be TERF activists, in particular in this instance, Get the L Out, who effectively took over the start of London Pride back in 2018 with a list of demands on basically getting the L out of LGBT. Now, we can have discussions as to whether or not these people are transphobic. However, once again, the gay press did not give them any kind of right of reply. They were simply labelled as being TERFs and transphobes and simply left at that. This therefore leaves the audience not really knowing what it is that this group stands for. And this is a big problem when it comes to the coverage of trans issues as a whole. A lot of LGBT people, including a lot of trans people, don't necessarily agree with the direction which trans activism has taken. And there are a lot of us who are writing opinion stories, we are going on YouTube, some of us are even going on national television to give our views, but you would not know this if you just listen to the gay press. They pretend that all of this is just a simple done issue. Look at the way in which they talked about Darren Grimes and that he is a gay man who should really know better when it comes to trans issues, or the way in which they talk about Ariel Scarcella, who they just consistently label as a TERF. And that doesn't even get into J.K. Rowling, who is not LGBT, but she certainly has views that a lot of people in the LGBT community respect and agree with, but because there are some activists who disagree with her, they run hit piece after hit piece. This gives out the impression that there is only one answer on trans issues, and that to simply diverge from it means that you are automatically a hateful person. And this is not good when you are an outlet that claims to represent this entire community. When you're not even putting forward views like mine or Blair's, and you pretend that all of this is just simply done, it's not fair on the audiences because they have no other idea on what's really going on. And of course there are other issues that they pretend are a done deal when they aren't, and one of the big ones is drag kids. Now, I find the idea of little children doing drag to be incredibly disturbing, and that is a view that is shared by a lot of people in the LGBT community. But again, the gay press does not want you to know that. They want you to think that all of this is fine and it's empowering and that it's homophobia to stop 10-year-olds from prancing around in scantily clad costumes. Like, again, that is not a universally accepted view within the LGBT community. So why is this so bad? I mean, after all, a lot of news publications out there openly have their own biases, so why can't the gay press? Well, there is a big difference. Whilst a privately owned news outlet can absolutely have whatever views that they like, the likes of Fox News or the Daily Mail or the Guardian aren't claiming to speak on behalf of an entire group of people. They know what their audience is, they know why their audience comes to them, and it's fair that they reflect their audience. However, the LGBT press does not really have that. As Queerty's tagline says, they are free from an agenda except for the gay one. And in fact, a lot of these outlets claim to just represent LGBT people as a whole. Not LGBT progressives or LGBT leftists, but LGBT people. So what they're really putting out there is that these are views that are held and accepted by people whose sexuality or gender differs from the mainstream. And because they are not making it clear that they are putting their own ideology first and foremost above all kinds of reporting or really kind of making their audience aware of what it is that they are talking about, they are willingly misleading and manipulating the people who are reading them, the people who are thinking that there is only one accepted view, when it's obvious that that isn't the case, because you have people like myself making videos or just discussing these subjects whilst also being LGBT. We are not a monolith, but the gay press likes to pretend that we are. And of course, all of this is not the end of the story. We're going to be seeing a lot more of this ramping up in the forthcoming months with the US election. There's probably going to be a lot more hit pieces aimed at conservative or right-leaning LGBT people. But what are your thoughts on the LGBT press? Do you think that it is something which is quite representative of LGBT people? Or do you think that they are misleading their audience like I do? Well, please let me know in the comments, and just be sure to like and subscribe. You can also hit the notification because all of this really helps me out if you like my content. You can also support me on Patreon and Subscribestar, and you can also follow me on Instagram and Twitter. Thank you all once again, and I'll see you all next time. And a special thanks to Alex Meadows, Alyssa Morris, Aurora T. Silver, Katie Adolphson, Dan Norman, Eda Meadows, Vanilla Cooney, James C. George, James UK, Jenny Morley, Jess, Joe, Gim Vandry, Latin Creature, Laura Mann Leaf, Voy Felicita, Rezi, Rose Hypnol, Steve Hendricks, LUCY, The Poor of Rizzo, Zoe, Stefan Hansen, Lacia Illiterati, Carla Jackson, Grey Brother, and the rest of my supporters on Patreon and Subscribestar.